Hello, viewers of the Indian Express. I'm Flora Swaye. With Donald Trump's return to the White House on the 20th of January after the inauguration, his influence on Europe is sure to become even more pronounced. From his support for the far right movements to his stance on key international issues in the European Union. To delve into what Trump 2.0 means for the European Union, we are joined by DW's political correspondent, Arthur Sullivan, all the way from Berlin. Welcome, Arthur.
Thank you very much for having me, Flora. It's good to be with you.
Like I said, Donald Trump's support for the far right political movements, particularly in Germany, has been a point of contention. How do you think his backing of figures like the AFD has impacted the political landscape within the European Union?
Yeah, I think, it's important to say that he hasn't fully backed the AFD at this stage, but there is clearly a sort of growing bond between, those two particular movements, the Trump MAGA movement, the AFD, and also generally, I would say, authoritarian populist movements across Europe, sometimes referred to as far right, although there are some differentiations. So I think one thing that's important to start off by saying is that when Trump won the election for the second time, there was first of all, a reaction in Europe that, okay, well, this could be bad in terms of the economy or defense and so on. But it also will give a lot of encouragement to some of those authoritarian populist right-wing movements, such as the AFD, such as Viktor Orban, Maloney, loads of them. There's loads of them at the moment all over Europe, these populist movements. And of course, when someone like Trump wins so convincingly in such in the world's, one of the world's biggest democracies, it's symbolically very important for them and gives them, I guess, encouragement. So in terms of beyond that, the sort of nature of those developing relationships, just strictly in terms of the AFD. So we know, for example, for Trump's inauguration, the party's candidate for chancellor, that's Alice Weidel, she was invited to the inauguration. She's not going, but her co-leader, Tino Cropella, is going. So that's one symbolic gesture. I mean, for example, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, is not going. She wasn't invited. Now, it's important to say that inaugurations, despite Trump sending out all these invites to world leaders, normally US presidential inaugurations don't have lots of world leaders there. But still, I think it is a sign of a certain kinship. I would say it's important, though, to add that at this point, it's more one-sided, this relationship from the AFD towards Trump. The AFD are really trying to court Trump. They really see, for whatever reason, they think that if they can align themselves with him, it will benefit them because even though Trump is not popular in Germany, he is going to be the president of the US. The US is probably Germany's most important ally, really. And so they see an opportunity for them to grow and, improve their own credibility with German voters, despite the fact that, they have a certain limit on their popularity in Germany, and despite the fact that Trump himself is not popular. So they're really trying to cultivate that relationship. For example, we saw during the election and in the run up to the actual vote, there was lots of AFD figures over in Mar-a-Lago, Trump's base. There was lots of them trying to help out with the movement, the Republican Party movement. So there is this growing sort of attempt by the AFD to align themselves with Trump. Trump hasn't said much about the AFD, but what is interesting is that I know we will get onto this, Flora, but Elon Musk, who obviously has been much more vocal on this issue, he wrote an article in one of the German newspapers promoting the AFD, and J.D. Vance, the next vice president of the US, obviously Trump's close ally, he was quite coy but did praise the article, or certainly I think he used a phrase like it's interesting. So they've been somewhat cautious. I think they know that the AFD are sort of way out there on the fringe, even within their own sort of far right standards. But they're still, I think, leaving it open to develop that relationship, which the AFD are fully on board.
You mentioned Italy's Giorgia Meloni and Hungary's Viktor Orban. How do you think that these alliances align with Trump's vision for Europe, and what challenges could these alliances pose for European Union's cohesion?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So again, in terms of, grouping these together, we do have to be careful. They don't all necessarily agree on the same things, but there is a common thread. And I would say the common thread, particularly with Orban and Trump, is this authoritarian populism. So strongmen leaders, they certainly like to project themselves as somewhat authoritarian, very, very strong in their rhetoric, and populists. I mean, they're undoubtedly embracing populist policies and ways of operating. It's interesting that if you remember back when Trump had the debate with Kamala Harris, he actually referenced Viktor Orban. I think he's one of the only world leaders he referenced as one of his allies, which was quite something because Hungary, for all its rich history, is a relatively small country, and for the leader of Hungary to be singled out by Trump in the debate does show the extent to which clearly they're getting along well. Meloni is an interesting one in Italy. I mean, she's been there a couple of years now. She's commonly referred to as far right, but one of the distinctions with Meloni, I mean, whereas people like Trump and certainly Orban, one of the things that binds them is this kind of common contempt for the international order, for the sort of old liberal consensus. A lot of that is quite popular with a lot of people, obviously, clearly with their electoral success. But they enjoy sort of spitting on the old order and saying we're going to upturn this. Maloney has been quite cooperative in terms of what we may refer to as the old order. She's developed quite good relations with the EU, with other European leaders, indeed with NATO. And I think Maloney is sort of an interesting case. She's clearly someone that Trump likes. He's praised her a lot. Elon Musk has praised her a lot, a great deal, in fact. So she's sort of, I would say, playing both sides. How it's going to sort of potentially divide the EU is really the key question, because the EU obviously operates as one. It's 27 member states. And while there is division within that, its great strength, and in fact, its great necessity in the years ahead, is that it has to stick together. Trump will probably, and the Trump administration will probably attempt some sort of a divide and conquer strategy. If it has, sort of these strong ideological alignments with figures like Maloney and Orban, it's probably going to try and leverage that, maybe give them preferential terms, possibly try and give them preferential terms in the event of tariffs and other issues. And that's potentially then going to lead to division within the EU. But how that actually is going to play out in practice is not clear. Because, as I said, the EU has to operate as one. It's not just a case that one country gets preferential trade terms, even though Trump will obviously try that. So it's going to be, I think, one of the earliest ways we're going to see how Trump treats Europe, if he's trying to sort of separate those populist leaders who he aligns himself with, and how that actually plays out in practice.
We'll talk about tariffs more, but before that, I want to ask you about Elon Musk. Of course, he's everywhere and he has an opinion on everything, be it on Justin Trudeau, be it on Keir Starmer. He's firing tweets at 2 o'clock in the night. So he's become this sort of a powerful figure in global politics with his narratives, and his views sort of currently the general consensus is that it aligns with Trump in one way or the other. How do you think Elon Musk's narrative, particularly on issues like regulation and even tech, how do you think it's going to influence the European Union's relationship with the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think with Musk, he's the world's richest man. He obviously has a lot of money. Maybe he's getting bored or something, because he has really been weighing in on political issues in Europe big time over the last few weeks and months, much more, I should add, even than someone like Trump. So he's particularly had a bee in his bonnet about probably the two, I guess, most globally influential countries in Europe, the UK and Germany. Obviously, the UK is not in the EU, but still a major player in certain areas, particularly in terms like security. And because it's part of the Anglophone world, I
Right.
think someone like Musk latches onto it. Germany as well, because I mean Trump, his ancestors come from Germany, even though he tried to claim they were from Sweden because he didn't want to
Yeah.
be tainted by Nazi links. But
Yeah.
there is this sort of I would say kinship and an interest from the Trump movement with those two countries in particular, and so that's why Musk, I think, in particular, has been weighing in on German and British politics. So he's really, as you said, he's been tweeting at all sorts of stuff, but he's been quite aggressive. I mean, he doesn't like the two governments because they're centre left, obviously the Labour Party in the UK and the current chancellor, perhaps not for much longer in Germany, Olaf Scholz, also from the centre left. So they're clearly movements, political parties that the Trump movement and that Musk, as a sort of a cipher of that movement, do not like, don't want to see in power. So I think that's part of it. I mean, there is this sense, I think, among people like Musk that the world is changing in their direction, and they don't like to see big countries, big influential countries like Britain and Germany with different governments. And so they're trying to influence the electorate. I mean, Musk wrote an opinion piece in one of the biggest newspapers here in Germany, the Sunday newspaper, promoting the AfD. He's regularly tweeting about them. He did an interview on X with the AfD's leader, Alice Weidel, I think last week, a long, very, shall we say, softball interview where he essentially allowed her to spew all kinds of things. Like, I mean, she claimed, for example, that the Nazis were communists, which is just an extraordinary perversion of history. I mean, anyone who has any understanding of history, and you don't have to be a communist to,
Right.
or in favor of communism to actually acknowledge this is just utterly wrong, but he left it unchallenged. So how is it going to ultimately play out? I mean, there's been a poll in the last few days from voters in the UK and Germany about Musk. And one thing that really came back from that was that they absolutely do not like him, do not appreciate his interventions. And the only group, actually, the only group of voters that can be identified in either of those two countries who do appreciate Musk's interventions, and I'm sure you can guess this, are AfD voters in Germany. So 70% of AfD voters think, great, Musk is a great guy. It's great that he's intervening because obviously, after what I just explained. So I think it's important to add these are old democracies, Britain and Germany. There's lots of political division. Not everyone agrees in these countries. There's a lot of problems, but they're long established democracies and they don't appreciate someone like Musk coming in and trying to interfere in this way. I mean, it's pretty cheeky, I'd say it is, to put it mildly. Now, another thing Musk has is the EU. He regularly is attacking the European Commission, particularly because the Commission has quite strong digital laws. And Musk, as we know, is the leader of, or the owner of X, formerly Twitter, the big social media platform. And they have been showing signs, the EU, that they're going to clamp down on X. Indeed, they've already got long-running disputes and legal cases with companies like Meta and so on. Musk doesn't appreciate this. Musk, above all else, is a multi-billionaire who wants to make money. Anything that he sees as a threat to that, he's going to obviously attack. And so I think we can expect to continue seeing him attacking the EU for its digital policies. One little note of caution, which is probably concerning to all in the EU, is that Vance, who I mentioned earlier, he at one stage linked the EU's treatment of X with American support for NATO, which again, extraordinary. I mean, how you can link those two issues is, I'd say, beyond most foreign policy analysts, but he did.
Absolutely.
Probably won't come to pass in reality, but it just shows you the kind of stakes that we're potentially playing with here in this strange new time that we're living in.
Geopolitics, but I cannot let you go without talking about the geoeconomics of it all. In Trump 2.0, how do you see the tariffs game playing out, and how do you see if there is a trade war happening?
Well, so let's go to what Trump has said and bear in mind that we do know Trump's bark is often worse than his bite. So you should listen to what he says, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen. And he himself would admit that. So Trump has said he is going to put tariffs of between 10% and 20% on all goods. China getting a different rate altogether, but that includes obviously EU goods. And then some, such as car making, could get tariffs of up to 100%. So that's the threat. Now, is it going to come? Is it going to happen? Let's see. I mean, there was, of course, in the first Trump term, there were tariffs between the EU and the US. There was a sort of not quite a trade war, but certainly a mini trade spat that was ultimately dealt with. I think we are going to see something. I think we're definitely going to see something, but the EU have been preparing for this since the summer and probably even before that, trying to assess where and how Trump may actually start levering the tariffs. It may be, a few percentage points here on certain sectors. It may be the worst case scenario. I think what we've seen in the last few days and weeks from certain EU sectors like car making and so on is they're really urging the EU don't hit back with tariffs because they're obviously terrified of the prospect of a trade war. The EU-US, they have a huge trade relationship. I mean, I think it's around 1.5 trillion euros in the last year. We have full figures for 2023. So that's obviously a huge amount of sectors, a huge amount of businesses at stake. I think if it comes to pass that the tariffs begin, it's obviously going to be a problem for the EU. But they do have options. I mean, Trump is obsessed with tariffs. He said it's the most beautiful word in the English dictionary. But
Yeah.
he's obsessed with goods. He talks about goods. He thinks about things like how many American cars are Europeans buying, how many American machines or goods. He doesn't always factor in things like services. And the EU does point out that they buy a lot of US services. They also are huge users of companies like Meta, Apple, Amazon, which are kind of a bit of both. One thing that the EU has sort of suggested is, and von der Leyen, the Commission president, has said this directly, one of the early ways to potentially do a deal with Trump would be on energy. We know about the Europe's energy issues because of the Russia war in Ukraine, and LNG, liquefied natural gas, this, sea transported gas. Europe needs lots of that at the moment, and America produces lots of it. So that's one area that they've talked about, possibly doing a deal on gas, on the EU getting more of that and energy in general. Trump as well said that. He said, I think he tweeted something like this, or maybe it was on his Truth Social platform, Europe needs to buy much more American oil and gas or else it's tariffs all the way, baby, or one of his usual
Right.
lines. So I think that's where we're seeing things at the moment. The EU has two approaches really. Try and get an early deal done, perhaps. Trump loves deals. I mean, that's his whole thing. He'll talk big and then says, I got a good deal. So that's probably the EU's First aim, try and get a deal done with energy probably playing a key role. And if tariffs start being leveled, the EU will probably start looking at counter tariffs and targeting certain American goods which come into the bloc, and indeed may well step up some of those digital cases that I've spoken around about some of the big US tech giants. So let's wait and see. I think no one knows what's really going to happen, but everyone is waiting for something.
You spoke about the Russia-Ukraine war, and we know that the Gaza ceasefire has just been announced, and now Biden and Trump are both sort of claiming credit for it. And of course, we have spoken about this before. We know Trump's disdain for NATO. How do you think the Ukraine-Russia war with respect to EU policies are going to be affected by Trump, especially if he takes a more sort of isolationist stance?
Well, I think actually that Gaza deal, and we don't know what's going to happen with it. It's not looking so great at the moment, but it does seem like the deal has been done. We do have to give Trump credit for that. I mean, before he even has come to office, it just shows you the power of some of his rhetoric and how his views and ways of carrying on do affect other world leaders. Netanyahu clearly wanted to do a deal in advance of Trump, and Trump's own negotiator achieved something that the Biden administration was not able to achieve. And I think we have to acknowledge that and recognize that there is a different attitude to Trump in lots of different parts of the world than perhaps his opponents in the US, and indeed politicians, mainstream politicians in Europe don't like about him. That's not the prevailing view in very many countries. And so there is this capacity perhaps for deals to be done. Trump has talked a lot in terms of Ukraine about, I want a deal to be done really quickly. Of course, his rhetoric always is over the top. I mean, he claimed a deal would be done 24 hours after he got elected, which is ridiculous. And particularly anyone who knows about the front line in Ukraine and how complex it is at the moment, any deal that's done on Ukraine is going to take a while. It's not going to be overnight. It's not going to be in a month. But I think what we have seen clearly is that Putin, the leader of Russia, and Trump, they both talk a lot about being willing to talk. And dialogue has been frozen between Putin and the West largely for the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Whereas I think when Trump comes back to office, I wouldn't be surprised to see relatively soon a meeting. Now, Trump, I mean, for example, we had some interesting comments yesterday from Trump's Treasury pick. So Scott Bessent, who is in line to become the new head of the US Treasury in the Trump administration, he spoke very strongly about sanctions against Russia. He said the Biden administration hadn't been strong enough on Russia, that they need to really ramp up some of the energy sanctions. And I thought that was very interesting because there's sort of an assumption in some quarters that the Trump administration are going to roll back or try to roll back some of what Biden's done, that they're going to try and make things easier for Russia. But, Trump, once he's in power, he likes the perception that he gets a good deal for his side, as it were. And I think it's impossible for anyone who understands America to say that Russia taking large chunks of Ukraine would be a good deal for America. It's clearly not. And I think the people around Trump will be telling them that. So I think they want to strengthen their position as much as possible when they do eventually sit down with Putin. Now, it's really, again, who knows how it's going to play out. The key as well on this is how much are they going to continue supporting Ukraine. I know one issue that the Americans and Trump in particular have spoken about is the age of conscription in Ukraine, that at the moment it's 25. They want that to be lowered to 18. They think, why can't you send more people to the front line when you want so much money in weapons from the West? So probably Ukraine are going to have to make a few concessions if they are going to continue getting that support from the Trump administration. But I think some of the maybe early terror that there was when Trump was elected, that he would sort of immediately sell Ukraine down the river, I think the realpolitik, the real politics of the situation will mean that that's probably not going to happen. But I think most sides do expect a dialogue between the leader of Russia and perhaps Trump and indeed Zelensky to happen at some stage in this year.
Arthur, as Trumpism makes a comeback to the White House, how do you think that the European Union can protect itself from the divisive effects of his political ideology? And what steps do you think that the EU leaders can take to sort of, safeguard unity and probably democratic values overall within the European Union bloc?
Well, this is a really pivotal moment for the EU. Trump's election, it certainly wasn't the beginning of the crisis. I think it was more like the final straw for the EU. The EU has had so many things that has not really gone its way over the last decade. Obviously, going back to the financial crisis, the euro crisis, then you had the sort of early stages of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Then you had the first Trump term, pandemic, and now the second Trump term, and then the big war in Ukraine. All these issues have sort of gradually chipped away at the EU. And then on top of that, you have this economic crisis in Europe. You have low productivity. You have a lack of innovation, the EU falling behind America on so many metrics. And I think Trump's election has really let's hope, and certainly EU leaders hope it's a wake up call. But the EU is trying to change itself. It's trying to bolster itself for this. It has launched two big reports in the last year: the Draghi report, the Letter report, aimed at really improving its productivity. And what they say consistently is it's not just about the EU's economy being better. It's like the EU's economy needs to be stronger in order for us to be secure, in order for our democracy to be preserved. And I think that's true because we've spoken throughout this, Flora, about these rising far-right authoritarian movements growing in power in Europe, emboldened by Trump. And so this sense that the old order is fading away and that it's the populists' time, that drumbeat can be felt in Europe. And the EU needs to stave that off by showing that actually the economy here can work, can become productive, and that a democratic system at that core is the common thread between prosperity and security. So that's really the challenge that the EU has. It's really a tightrope it has to walk because 27 governments, I don't know how many languages, but a lot in there, a lot of different political systems, and a lot of division in terms of the different visions they have for the world order and for the EU order. So the EU is really going to have to try and stick together. And above all else, it's not just convincing Trump, it's not convincing Americans, it's convincing itself, it's convincing its own voters that the EU's sort of pre-existing model, democratic, very much rooted in the older international order, that's worth preserving, worth sticking with, and whilst also doing that they can bring that innovation, bring that productivity to their economies, and I guess stand up for themselves. I think there's probably a little bit of a fear that, and we've seen this initially maybe in some of the early rhetoric from perhaps businesses and industries, there's a fear around Trump, and I think what the last thing the EU should do is sort of bow down to him and simply be a victim or just, play whatever game he wants to play. The EU needs to really, find its backbone and stand up for itself and the values it has, whilst also bolstering its economy for the challenges that are clearly coming.
As Europe braces for the return of Donald Trump, the next few years will definitely be pivotal in defining the United States and European Union relations. It's certainly a wait and watch moment for the entire European Union bloc. Arthur, thank you for shedding light on how Europe might prepare for the impact of Trump 2.0. Viewers, for more updates and news on Donald Trump's return to the White House and the inauguration on the 20th of January, please stay tuned to the official YouTube channel of the Indian Express.